Hi, welcome back. I'm Ralph Ranalli, your host for the Economics for Inclusive Prosperity podcast. University of Chicago economist and Professor Luigi Zingales has been studying capitalism for nearly 40 years. Ever since he moved to the United States from Milan, where he'd become disillusioned with the crony capitalism and economic unfairness in his native Italy. But he pretty quickly discovered that the U.S. version of capitalism was no bargain either. He's been trying to fix it ever since through his books, which include Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists and A Capitalism for the People, and his work as director of the Stigler Center at the UChicago Booth School of Business, which, under his leadership, has focused on regulatory capture and other distortions that special interest groups impose on capitalism. Zingales earned his Ph.D. in economics from MIT, and he's been named one of Foreign Policy magazine's top 100 global thinkers. He also hosts his own podcast, Capitalisn't, with journalist Bethany McLean. He joins me today to talk about why maximizing what he calls shareholder welfare is better than maximizing shareholder returns, and how the erosion of institutions and norms and the runaway accumulation of wealth have combined in a dangerous downward spiral, and why antitrust and pro-competition regulation are better tools to fix capitalism than taxation, and finally, some practical ways that populist anger can be channeled into corporate governance reform. That's a pretty ambitious agenda, so let's get to it. So, Luigi, welcome.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you for being here. You've been studying capitalism for a long time. So I got to ask, has there been a moment in your career when you were more concerned about the future of capitalism and where it's taking us than you are right now?
This is really a softball. The answer, of course, is no, but for two reasons. Number one is because objectively, I think that the United States is in a very tricky situation right now. I used to compare the United States to Italy, but now I think it's unfair to Italy because the level of capitalism is at a much worse stage than has been in Italy for many years. The second is because the United States is not just any country, has been by and large the large shining city on the hill for everybody who believes in capitalism around the world. And now they see all their dreams basically destroyed. And then many of the conspiracy theory anti-capitalists that people did not believe, they seem to be true under their eyes.
Right. Well, that's not just everybody, right? I mean, it's you personally, because when you moved from Italy to the United States in, I think it was 1988,
yeah,
you really saw capitalism in the U.S. that was more comparative and that was more competitive and more meritocratic than what you saw in Italy, which was sort of the crony system. Can you talk a little bit, take us back there a little bit to sort of the origins of your coming to the United States and wanting to study capitalism and where you developed your critiques of its flaws?
So, first of all, I was attracted to come to study in the United States because the United States was the best place to study economics. I think was clearly above everybody else by a large margin. And so I was interested in the topic and I wanted to study here. I grew up in Italy as fairly conservative, and I'm quite unique in my generation because my generation of Italian economists, they all were not only communists, but to the left of the Communist Party. Stuff I tell Americans, you need a GPS to find out how left they are because you can't find them. And I wasn't. But then when I arrived here, what I noticed with interest is that all my friends were very leftist. Pretty quickly changed their attitudes, and they became, many actually, much more to the right of me, and much more dedicated to free markets than even I am. And so I started wondering why that was the case. And in part, I think the study of economics maybe help you see the light, but in part is that growing up in Italy in my generation, you saw that the system was not working. You saw the system was corrupt, a lot of patronage, a lot of unfairness. And so attacking capitalism was the natural way for people to revolt. And then they came here and they saw that actually you can have a capitalist system where the allocation of position is pretty meritocratic, where also the people who make mistakes pay no matter where they are in the social strata and so on and so forth. And I think that that really describe a system that was very different and much more attractive. And so I attribute the fact that many of my colleagues got converted to this important difference.
Yeah, so you've written a number of books, right? But I think two of them are sort of the best known. There was Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists, which you published in 2002. You argued that the greatest threat to capitalism wasn't from external opponents like the communists, but from powerful capitalists and businesses who manipulated the system for their own benefit. And then I think it was like 11 years later, you published Capitalism for the People, where you said that American capitalism had kind of lost its way and was too focused on the interests of the elite rather than the broader public. Can you just walk me through how your thinking evolved between those two books and up to the present day?
Yeah, actually, that's surprisingly simple because the first book that was written with Raghu Rajan was a book that kind of was born from our realization. He's Indian, I'm Italian. We came to this country. We saw how much better things were working here and how difficult it was to export similar solutions around the world. And so part of our conclusion is the reason why better institutions are not adopted in other countries, not because our country don't know how to do it, is simply because the local elites don't want this to happen. My favorite story that actually I learned going around and promoting the book is that in Mexico, shortly after the so-called tequila crisis of 1994, there were some experts from the World Bank that went down trying to teach to the locals how to create a credit registry. For those of you who are not in finance, a credit registry is a very useful institution that makes sure that if I sort of pledge my collateral to a loan to Ralph, I don't also pledge to somebody else. So if somebody else wants to make a loan to me, go to the credit registry and see whether my collateral has been pledged or not. And of course, with the kind of a little bit colonial attitude that many experts, especially for the World Bank, have. They went down with the hat and say, we are teaching you how to do these things because you don't know how to do things. And shortly after, the local said, are you kidding me? Of course we know how to do things. The reality is we don't want them to do. And why? Is because if I'm a Mexican bank, I know everybody in town, so I know that Ralph has pledged the collateral to his friend. I'm not going to lend it to him, but I also know that Jose is a good guy, and so I lend to him. The fact that it's not written anywhere give me an advantage, because if you are a gringo bank and coming down, you have no idea sort of who is Ralph and who is Jose. And so you don't lend to anybody or you lend to everybody. Either way, you lose money. And so I have a big advantage and I want to keep it. So I think that that's a sign that good institutions don't exist, not because the people are ignorant or because the people are revolting against them. Don't exist because good institutions create competition, and competition tends to actually reduce the rents of the people who have the rents that tend to be the incumbent, tends to be the rich people. That book was very much inspired by the idea that somewhat the United States was the shining city on the hill, the example to which everybody should compare itself. And then the financial crisis came, and I realized that actually the United States was not the shining city on the hill, or maybe as, I don't know, this is hard to tell whether it become not so or was not so to begin with. I think it's a combination of the two, but certainly I saw all the flaws, and so that book was, to some extent, a desperate attempt to say this corruption is taking down this country. However, the big advantage I saw vis-a-vis, for example, Italy, is that there was a tradition of good institutions. And so my hope was by appealing to that tradition, you could actually make a difference. And one of the things that is pretty remarkable, if I may say so, the book is 2012, so you went pretty close. And for those of you who are young enough not to remember, 2012, somebody like Mitt Romney was the Republican candidate for president. It seems like a century ago, right?
Right.
And I said in a book, it said, given the condition, this is time, the populist today is inevitable. And the only question is, which form will it take? And I was hoping that there would be kind of a more populist revolt a la Theodore Roosevelt, where you kind of clean up a lot of things that don't work and make the system better to work better. And I have to admit, more than 10 years later, that the book was a failure. And so not because I didn't see the problem, but clearly I was unable to fix it. And I think that the system has got worse and worse to a level, in my view, that is appalling. And I sometimes call my brother, and my brother reminds me and said, in Italy, maybe we do some of this stuff, but at least we have the decency of not bragging about it, okay? The fact that our president does it and brags about it is an indication of the level that we've reached, which I think is very problematic.
Right. I mean, I think that's probably a little too much pressure to put on one book to fix a problem of that magnitude. So I think maybe you need to cut yourself a little bit of slack. But it was a very hopeful time, right? I mean, it was like you said, it was a much different Republican Party, and it was after the financial crisis when there was, I think, at least some impetus to make some changes. Although there's been a lot of critiques of how what the response was to the financial crisis, the housing crisis. But I wanted to turn to one of your concepts that you've written about quite a bit, which is this distinction between what you call pro-market and pro-business. And you argue that big business exploits government power to entrench themselves rather than compete freely, and that doesn't make for a system where markets serve broader societal interests. Can you talk a little bit more about that pro-market versus pro-business distinction? Because I think to maybe the uninitiated, those two things kind of sound very similar.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the point. I'm enamored now of this expression that I think originally was said by Baudelaire, that the biggest trick that the devil played is to convince you that it didn't exist. And so I think that the business interest was so successful to make it the one and the same thing. And so very often you see people identifying a attitude in favor of market with an attitude with the business sector, and you think that the business sector is trying to promote this. But in reality, a really competitive market, at least the way we think as economists, is actually, number one, is a public good, because a good market benefits everybody, but precisely because it benefits everybody, it doesn't benefit any particular person so much that this person will spend money and resources to lobby for it. So it is the ultimate public good, a well-functioning market. And capitalists really don't like competitive markets. It's just they like competitive markets when they go and buy something in the product they buy, but they want their market not to be competitive. And to be completely fair, in business school, we teach them a lot of techniques how to make their market less competitive. And some of those techniques, I think, are good in the sense if you invest more in technology and etc. This might be good for everybody. But some of that techniques are not that good because they are kneecapping their competitors. And of course, the worst one is the one to get the government in your pocket. And in the book, I distinguish between an old attitude of many capitalists that was get the government off my back, to the new attitude, which is I want the government in my pocket.
Right. It's interesting because I listened to the Capitalism episode. Capitalism is your wonderful podcast. I think everybody should give it a listen. You did a really interesting episode with Sven Becker, the Harvard historian, where he talked about that relationship, the relationship between, and you both talked about it actually, the relationship between capitalism and the state, where it has this sort of veneer of being adversarial, but it's really it's really necessary coexistence. Can you talk about that and how, what the real relationship between workable capitalism and the state is?
Yeah, I think that there is a simplification of, if you want, the Chicago tradition that makes appear that markets are a natural creation that will spontaneously emerge and work spontaneously, and everybody lives happily ever after. I think that one of my differentiation here is I always believe that markets do not arise spontaneously, and in part is because when you grow up in Italy, you see that it's not that easy, so they don't arise spontaneously. They are a creation, at the very minimum, supported by some institution of the state. One of my favorite short stories is by former Italian President Luigi Zingales, who was an economist. And when he goes and gives some lecture on markets, the image he gives is like a country fair with the police checking that everything takes place according to rules. So you need to have a good functioning, for example, law enforcement for markets to work. But it's not just that. We take, all too often in economics, we take property rights as exogenously defined, but they're not. They are an institution of the capitalist system, and more so when we move into intellectual property rights. In a sense, is easier to think that people might have a notion of what is the property of a piece of land, but the property of an idea is really something that is a human creation. And so you need the proper economic system, the proper political system to support the capitalist system. And one aspect that I don't think is so present in saving capitalism, but certainly is present in a capitalism for the people, and I think I developed even more afterward, is that you need some form of a democratic system to support a good capitalist system, because you need a referee that cannot be bought. In a capitalist system, you want more stuff to be for sale, but not the rules themselves. And so how do you ensure that a system is actually not prone to corruption? And here, ironically, I got an insight from an earlier predecessor of Bitcoin. One idea behind Bitcoin was a paper by Haber and Stornetta that trying to determine how you seal or stamp a digital document in a way that is not corruptible. And they say the best way is to basically distribute to everybody, because if you want to corrupt, you have to corrupt everybody. And I think that democracy is a little bit like this. If the rules are decided by everybody, it's difficult to corrupt everybody. If the rules are decided by a small group of people, you know what? Either directly or indirectly, they end up being corrupted. And sometimes they're corrupted because they walk out of the room stuffed with oily cash. But that's actually in developed countries that less and less the case. First of all, because people use wire transfer, but more importantly, because there are more subtle ways to corrupt you than just really paying you cash. And those are the most dangerous way, because they distort the way you create the rules.
You know, it's interesting. You actually left Italy before the Berlusconi era, right? And that was some people, I guess, have called Berlusconi like the prototype oligarch for the age we're sort of in right now. What were you? I assume you were watching Berlusconi very carefully from the U.S. What did you learn from Berlusconi about that sort of takeover of the referee, the sort of buying out of the referee? And was it for you a preview of what you thought might be coming here?
Yes, but with some caveats. So first of all, you're absolutely right. I observed very closely, and actually it created also some tension in the family, because my brother was a big supporter of Berlusconi, and I had an instinctive dislike from the beginning. Okay, so that created some family tension at the Christmas dinners.
Oligarchs and family tension. This is deja vu for you all over again with the Trump administration.
Exactly, but I think that maybe because we play politics for 2,000 years in the Catholic Church, but Italians are a bit advanced in many political dimension, and not necessarily in the good dimension, because we invented fascism. Fascism is really a new ideology invented in Italy, so nothing to be proud of. But we are very often a trendsetter, and I think with Berlusconi we were so much so that one of the big regrets in my life is I made a mistake, because when I was writing A Capitalism for the People, it was in 2011, and Trump actually considered running for president that particular moment, but then decided not to. And I was very intrigued, because I saw immediately the analogy with Berlusconi. It's impossible for anybody who knows Berlusconi not to see it. In the sense, they are so similar. First of all, the business they come from, they both come from the real estate market. And I'm sorry to say, the real estate market is not a market, is a corruption system everywhere in the world. So when they say we are businessmen and we're going to bring markets to the world, and you think, well, what experience do you have? Is kind of they both are phenomenal entertainers. Berlusconi started his career. This is a point in favor of Trump. He wasn't born rich. He started his career as an entertainer in the big cruises that at the time were popular and Italy had. And so he's a born entertainer. He's really somebody that is very good in front of a TV. And of course, Trump had that. And even in the small detail, they are very good marketing people that have a good feeling of the belly of their respective countries. They're both obsessed with air, of lack of thereof, and they're both obsessed with women. So they're so similar that actually it's impossible not to see the comparison. And so in a first draft of my book, I actually talk about this, and I said, look, like Italy went in that direction, maybe the United States will go under Trump. And then I had some comments on my first draft, and one of my colleagues said, oh, the book is great, but that analogy with Trump is like completely crazy. Nobody will think that he can even be nominated, let alone elected. So I took it out. And the only sort of a claim to fame is that I actually published that little piece at the time. So I had the record. If you Google Zingales Trump City Journal 2011, you find the article I wrote back then, I'm the first to make the analogy between Trump and Berlusconi, which is obvious. Now, I have to say...
You have the receipts. That you
I have the receipts.
The Nostradamus of that time, yes.
But I have to say that now I can see also the differences. And I think that, first of all, Berlusconi was more of a joker, and he was an entertainer, but also was lighter. He wasn't mean in the way in which Trump ends up being mean. And I think that makes a gigantic difference. And to be honest, Berlusconi never tried anything even close to something like January 6th. And to be fair, he had more reasons to try something like this because, the first time he won an election, but because Italy is a country of conspiracies, they rearranged a coalition so to depose him after only 6 or 7 months he was in power. And he had to stay in the opposition for many years. And then the third time he got elected, he was basically deposed by the rest of the European countries and by the spread on the Italian treasury market that was growing, but was growing in part because Europe did not trust him. And surprise, surprise, when he stepped down and Monti went to power, the spread remained the same until Draghi then intervened and said whatever it takes, etc. And now you can argue that this was done because you could trust Monti, but then the point is, in part, he was deposed by the spread, not by a popular vote. So I think Berlusconi had many more reasons to be resentful and was less. Oh, I forgot an important point, that both of them had an enormous amount of legal suit. And Berlusconi did, to some extent, better than Trump, because Trump had to pardon a bunch of people. Berlusconi changed the law, the statute of limitation, so that in Italy, all trials last forever. So if you shorten the statute of limitation, as long as you have a good lawyer that drags on the trial, you get free. And so he got free of almost all the trial, except one in which he had to do a bit of community service, but nothing to write home about.
Yeah, I don't know if Berlusconi ever deployed the Trump's newest gambit, which is to sue the United States, effectively suing himself and then seeking damages from the government for himself.
No, I don't think he arrived to that level.
So I think some people think of Trump as kind of the beginning of this sort of era we're in, but you have a concept which you've written about, which I think you call it amoral drift, right? That it's something that's happened over a long time. It's sort of a slow death of kind of a benign corporate missions that's sort of buckling under the weight of pressures of the competitive markets and shareholder pressures and then sort of weak legal and government guardrails or intervention. Can you talk about amoral drift and whether there is any if we had done, if there'd been, if things had been done differently, that could have been arrested, or it might not have happened.
Yeah, I think that really economics should be a mean to an end, not the end. And I think that one of the shortcomings of the so-called neoliberal system is that basically has no values. And when you have no values and you take economics too seriously, at some point you start to trade off everything. And if everything becomes for sale, also your values, it's very hard to resist a moral erosion of things that, again, you're not supposed to do. And I think coming out of World War II, most Western countries had two very strong forces. Number one is the desire, at least in Europe, to rebuild the country after the destruction of the war. But also this sense of we need to have a decent system because otherwise the communists will take over. I think there was a really, people, in my view, underestimates how important that threat was to give to the neoliberal system a bit of a sense of mission that after the fall of the Berlin Wall completely lost. And to me, really, the turning point is not so much that the more conservative parties were playing a certain role, because they always play that role, is that there was no balance on the other side. So not only you had 8 years of Reagan plus 4 of Bush, but after that you had 8 years of Clinton that in many respects was not a balance, but went exactly in the same direction. And I find that the social democrat or labor, whatever you want to call it, around the world are at the top of the example of corruption. If you go from Clinton to Tony Blair to Schroeder in Germany, I think is unbelievable. The level in which they turn around and they go and work for the firms that regulated them without even apologizing, whatever. And I think that that was really, really a big step down in this direction. And the other huge step down was, in my view, the reaction to the financial crisis. I can say that loud because I'm not preaching after the fact. I was a very active voice at the time, and I was accused by many people that I was too moralistic. In fact, a colleague said, "Oh, you're turning populist," and that was a very useful comment because I started to think about it and say, number one, why is this used as a negative term? And number two, what does it really mean? And so I think that the Capitalism for the People is part of the result of me also discovering the reality, the American history of the People's Party. In Europe, it's very difficult to separate populism either from fascism or from some form of communism. And so it's almost natural that there's this negative connotation because the way these two regimes end up in history was not good, to use a British understatement. But in the United States, the People's Party was a very positive force in the dynamics and was a party actually in favor of universal education. And one of the reasons why in the United States pioneered basically mandatory high school education for everybody. And so they were at the forefront in this with respect to the war, was thanks to the initiative of the People's Party, and was a group that was very active in the antitrust debate and so on and so forth. So I discovered my inner populist roots through that process.
So you've written about this concept that you call shareholder welfare maximization, which is sort of in opposition to the more traditional concept of shareholder value maximization. Can you sort of explain the difference and maybe talk a little bit about how a shareholder welfare maximization system could somehow come into being?
Sure. Let me start with a very silly example, but I think it makes the point, okay? I have two siblings in Italy, and our father left us some agricultural land, not very big, but some agricultural land that is managed mostly by my brother, okay? And this is in the Veneto area where corns grow very, very well, okay? And I figure out, and I'm no agricultural economist, but I said, if the corns grow well, probably marijuana grows well as well. And in Italy, it's not legal yet, but I said, it's come legalization in this country. Sooner or later, we'll legalize in Italy. Why don't we start thinking about it? Because we want to be upfront in that innovation. And my sister said, over my dead body, I will never, ever produce marijuana. Our father would be ashamed. It's like completely. And while she owns only a third of it, we're a good family, so we go along and we give up. And so why do I make this long story? Is because people in their normal choice of life, they don't maximize income, they maximize utility. And there are some situations in which you think that the income is not worth it, okay? Now, I'm not saying that everybody's like that, but I think that there are a lot of people, and of course, if you have to give up, if you're starving, it's a different story. If you have to give up a ton, it's a different story. But I think the fact that we're not really trying to squeeze every dime in every situation, in the grand scheme, helps society quite a bit. However, we have created a system of corporations that is making impossible to bring in the values of the shareholders, okay? And notice that a lot of people have spoken about, we want to bring the workers, the community. I actually, in this respect, I start from the most traditionally point of view of saying the companies belong to the shareholders because they are the residual claimant. And I like to say that whoever pays the bill picks the restaurant, right? So at the end of the day, the shareholders pays the bill, and so they have the right to pick the restaurant. What is funny, in this world, they say, no, you shareholder pay the bill, but the manager pick the restaurant. Actually, we force the manager to only pick one restaurant, the one that only produces the cheapest food on the face of earth. That seems like a crazy system, especially they sell this as this is true democracy, true freedom. I said, wait a minute, if I'm free to do whatever I want. So I want the shareholders to be able to give direction on moral values to the company and the company to follow. And that's exactly what shareholder welfare maximization is. And I'm actually writing a book with my co-author, Oliver Hart, on this, in which you're actually providing some mechanism that makes it easy for shareholders to transmit their values to corporation. Because one of the big problems is that, of course, most shareholders are small, but together we own quite a big chunk. And it's just the 401ks represent a big chunk of the equity market. But while collectively we are important, individually we have no say. And so we're trying to find mechanisms to make it feasible for us to actually influence the way companies are run.
Yeah. I mean, wasn't that just represented by the whole ESG investing movement? Because you had that for a sort of a shining moment. There was this ESG movement, and then things just seemed to turn negatively on it, and it was woke, and it was anti-competitive, and it was it seemed like it just got completely dumped on, and now you never hear much about it again.
Again, I think the big difference is whether you are an elitist or a populist. The ESG was an elitist movement. Was Larry Fink waking up in the morning, and actually the way it was described is after flying with personal jet to some place in Canada, realized that there were no salmon because of climate change. And so he flew back with his jet and say, we should fight climate change. Okay? So that to me, it's not that fighting climate change is not important, but why Larry Fink decides for everybody. Okay? Because he manages your money and my money, but we didn't express in any way. So and as a result, he got a slap on the wrist by the Republicans that say, you have no justification for doing what you're doing. Now, I think they're right in saying there's no justification. They're wrong in saying, oh, the only thing you should do is maximize shareholders' value. What you should do is try to get a movement from the bottom up to say, what do we want? And actually, I can give you a preview that with Oliver, I did a survey of 401k holders asking on some moral questions. And most of them, even when they are incentivated to the extent we can incentivate in a survey, but they seem to react, not all of them, but the vast majority, in a way that seems to prioritize moral value. So I think there is room to have a what I like to call corporate democracy that is very different than what the oligarchy that Larry Fink was trying to impose.
Yeah. So you had a really interesting, speaking of Capitalisn't again, your podcast, you had a very interesting and also scary episode where you talked about the growing influence of the tech titans and the platforms they control, and the emergence of these sort of anti-democratic philosophical frameworks that kind of legitimize that they're using to legitimizing their accumulation of power. And it almost seems like, the days of maximizing shareholder value as the only imperative might seem like the good old days compared to the dark enlightenment. Can you talk a little bit about
Sure.
that?
I think that, first of all, whenever it was, I think it was in 2022, end of 2022, when Mark Andreessen wrote the Techno-Optimist Manifesto, I read it and I said, oh, thank God at least mention at the bottom that was inspired by Marinetti, because for those of you who are not Italian, the last intellectual movement produced by Italy of any international fame was the Futurism, and the leader was this Marinetti, which at the beginning of the 20th century wrote a Futurist manifesto that, if you just adjust the terms for the technology, was identical to what Mark Andreessen wrote. And I was pretty shocked because I know my Italian history well, and I know that Marinetti ended up straight into the fascist regime, okay, and became one of the intellectual sort of supporter of the fascist regime. So at the time, remember, Mark Andreessen was still a Carrie Carden member of the Democratic Party.
Right,
so I said, that smells something funny here, okay? And then there was the conversion on the way to Damascus, in which all of a sudden Mark Andreessen saw the light, but instead of being God this time, unfortunately, was Donald Trump. And then I listened to a couple of interviews he gave, and I got really, really concerned. I said, okay, now I understand why. And then I heard this Irving Curtis. Now, in Italy, I had a high school friend who was fascist, okay? But he was not apologetic. I think my view is that he was much influenced by the fact his grandfather, I think, was beaten to death by the partisan immediately after the liberation, because, of course, there was this revenge moment. And, when you grow up with that image, but he was ideologically deeply fascist and supporting stuff that, to me, they sounded completely crazy, okay? But for the rest, he's a good guy, so what do you do? But when I heard Irving Curtis, I said, oh, this is my old friend, identical. There is nothing new. At least Magnetti, when he wrote the first time, there was some originality, but here, they're not even trying to pretend. And then I asked myself the question, why this is the case? And unfortunately, the answer is pretty simple, is this leader of technology understand that we are in for a major social disruption. And there are two ways. One is you slow down this adoption so that society stays together. The second is you move fast, break things,
yeah,
and keep the one protesting in jail or under sort of house arrest. Okay, right. And a more fascist regime is an intellectual justification for doing the latter. And so they are trying to find stuff to justify their power. But they go to, when Irving Curtis said that we should have...
Curtis Yarvin, right?
Yeah, Irving Curtis, sorry, I got inverted. Irving Curtis. When he says that we need to have some leaders that are like CEOs. But what does he know of corporate governance? CEOs that they own the company, that's called absolute monarchy? Or are they CEOs that are accountable to some shareholders? And plus, we know that there is a reason why we separate profit-making activity from governmental activity, is that profit-making activities are much easier to implement because there is a profit motive and we can monitor. The other are much more complex. That's the reason why we need a different form of accountability. So the people who say, oh, we want to transport business into politics, either they are stupid or they have a second motive. And I always go for the second motive.
Right. I mean, I wanted to ask you about sort of the role of the media, but also academia, sort of the pond where we swim. Why isn't there more discernment about intellectual ideas that just seem to be kind of reverse engineering justifications for something which is completely different? They're not the result of genuine intellectual inquiry. They're just kind of backfilling an intellectual justification. Why do you think they get a sort of pass on discernment from media and academia to the extent that they do? Actually, I don't even know if you agree with that statement, but it seems to me that they get a bit of a pass from at least sort of academic and intellectual rigor.
I think that I want to pass on the media because I know less, but in academia, I think that what is interesting is basically not 100%, but 95% of all the academics I know are anti-Trump. So it's not that in principle they're not against Trump. The question is to what extent they buy into ideas that are potentially very dangerous, number one. Number two, as you said, not particularly well justified, but more they reverse engineer the interest of some sponsors. And I think that the number one thing is the pressure of money on intellectuals has always existed in history. But now I think is particularly sort of subtle and pervasive. And so that makes it much more difficult to uncover. And ironically, the group that is most resistant to this are the economists themselves. And I give you an example that...
Why do you think that is?
I'll come to that, but it's quite interesting. So think about a person that I admire, that is perfectly respectable, etc., like Janet Yellen, okay? Janet Yellen, as you probably know, after she stepped down from the Fed, she gave speeches. Now, do you want to guess how much she made in those speeches in a year?
It was a lot, but I don't know the figure.
Guess.
14 million.
Oh, wow. No, exactly. You're one of the few people who overestimate. Only 8. Only
okay.
8.
Okay? It was only 8. Okay, then.
Only 8. Now, I don't think there is anything wrong in doing that. However, I raised with many of my colleagues and said, look, if you did some moves that will massively penalize banks, probably you will get a few less invitations to go on those speeches. So because we're economists, we should have rational expectation. So do you think that in making any decision, the prospect of 8 million will play any role in that decision? And all my colleagues said, no. And I said, come on, guys, you're economists. You think that incentives drive everybody, and why they drive everybody except economists, who, by the way, study incentive every day. So it really defies gravity. And recently, I've done a paper with some co-authors looking at how much people trust less a paper when they discover that was financed by a particular company, or basically there was some form of conflict of interest, which doesn't need to be monetary, can be career incentives, can be a lot of things, okay? And we find that when asked anonymously, most economists behave like normal human beings that tend to discount these papers. However, there is a difference. So if you are you're economist, and we describe the situation of a finance guy, you find that's obscene that a financial economist was financed by a hedge fund, and you discount that a lot. But when it comes to IO, if this was like a company financing an antitrust expert, you think that's not a problem. Now, when you ask the financial economist, it's exactly vice versa, okay? So everybody believes that other people are subject to pressure, to distortion, etc., not themselves. This cognitive dissonance is completely fascinating in my view.
Can you just talk about inequality for a second? We're in a situation where we have record levels of inequality, wealth accumulation. Can you make systemic changes to financial systems that might result in better outcomes without fundamentally addressing underlying equality? I remember reading a paper from a guy at Brookings, and he wrote that it was a quote that wealth in and of itself is not problematic, and that was something that I found hard to believe, because I think when you can't buy another super yacht or a compound in every vacation paradise, there's a point at which wealth simply converts directly into power, and you just sort of end up with these stateless super citizens. And the state is where democracy resides. So can we continue to have these sort of a situation where there's no effective upper limit on wealth, where you have these stateless sort of super citizens. Is that possible?
That's a very good question. So I start from a prior that accumulating wealth is good, not bad, and incentives are good, not bad. However, I have to say that when the wealth inequality becomes enormous, it's very difficult to maintain the institution in place. And take, for example, the scandal that has emerged around Epstein. So forget, not that we should forget because it's a tragedy, but forget the sexual part, okay? But it's clear from what has emerged that there was really an Epstein class that was protecting itself and was manipulating power in a way that is enormous, to the point of, come on, a British minister giving private information to Epstein. So this is if this wasn't official documentation, you would say that this is a conspiracy theory, right? You couldn't believe it. And so I think that certainly what we observe in the United States is a combination of erosion of institutions, erosions of norms, and enormous accumulation of wealth. And the two goes hands in hands and to some extent feed each other. And so I think that one of the many reasons why I believe we should be much more aggressive with competition rules is because if the markets are more competitive, it's more difficult to make a lot of money. I always cite the story, this is 10 years ago, I think, at this point, but Carlos Slim in Mexico used to be the richest man on earth. And one year, his wealth was cut in half. And why was cut in half? Oh, because some deregulation in the telecommunications sector took place in Mexico. Okay? So I think that that is an indication of the first instrument to intervene, because, you know, through taxation, not that we shouldn't tax the proper amount to these people, but through taxation is much harder. I think that the way you need to do it is, in my view, through competition and making it difficult that this proportion amount are built to begin with.
Is that what you and Oliver Hart are working on? The sort of ways to sort of re-inject competition into the system in a way that'll...
With Oliver, we're working more on the governance side of things, how to re-inject values into corporate governance.
Can you give us a preview of that work and what?
Yeah, I think that I think there are two steps. One, which is very simple, but very important in my view, is we show how Milton Friedman was wrong when he wrote in 1970, but was wrong for a very subtle reason. In a sense, he was basically saying that maximizing shareholder value, doesn't use the term shareholder value, maximizing profits is what any investors want, even if investors have some social preferences. They are better off having the firm maximizing profits, distribute those profits, and use those profits to the charity they prefer. Okay? So that's a very, very clever trick, because you say, look, I don't need to ask you, investor, what you want. I know that that's what you want. I decided what you want. And surprise, surprise, I decided what you want, what I like, which is just maximize profits. Now, Milton Friedman was very clever, and so he used as an example this one of donation, where this kind of equality applies. Okay? However, the moment you realize that in most decisions, companies have a comparative advantage. So when it comes to donate $1, if I donate $1, Microsoft donate $1 is, nothing changes, okay? But imagine that we're coming to pollution. Imagine I own DuPont, okay? DuPont maximize profits, dump a bunch of PFOA in the Ohio River, and I am concerned about, like my sister was concerned not producing marijuana, I might be concerned of not killing the people that are downstream in the Ohio River. So I want to actually clean up. It costs me infinitely more to clean up than not to pollute to begin with. Okay, this is really an example that the idea that maximizing profits is what shareholders want is not true. The general term is to maximize shareholders' welfare. Now, maybe all your shareholders only care about profits, so is a possibility. I don't exclude that possibility, but I don't know why we should assume it to begin with, okay? And by the way, shape all the norms and codes accordingly, so that according to some lawyers, I had some discussion with lawyers, they say, oh, but the fiduciary duty is toward the shareholders. So are you telling me that your fiduciary duty is to be immoral? So I'm no lawyer, but I have an innate sense of justice that tells me that the law cannot force you to be immoral. Okay? And if this is the case, I want to change the law. Okay? So there's no possibility. Now, so this we did almost 10 years ago. We had the first result here, and then we elaborate with some other results. One that is particularly appealing is that because shareholders today are very diversified, when it comes to expressing their opinion, as long as they're not only looking at profits, period, but they have a little bit of pro-social activity, they might actually vote in a much more pro-social way than people will expect. Let me make an example. Imagine that you own 10 shares of Exxon, okay? And probably you own more than that in transparency because you own some S&P stock and Exxon in the S&P. So I'm sure that whether you like it or not, you own at least 3 shares of Exxon, okay? Imagine that people say, Exxon has to decide whether to curb some of the pollution, but will cost $3 billion. $3 billion is a lot of money, okay? And most people care about pollution, but not $3 billion worth, right? However, imagine that there is a proposition up for a vote, and you actually go to vote, and you should reason in the following way. Say, most of the time, I don't make any difference. So my vote is irrelevant. So let's not even waste my time thinking about those situations. Let's think about the rare state of the world in which my shares make a difference. And so if you have 3 shares and the cost is, let's say, $3 billion, and imagine that there are 3 billion shares that I think roughly might be right for Exxon. This means that is $1 a share. So if you vote in favor and your vote changed the outcome, you are going to tax yourself for $3. Okay? Of course, we prefer $3 more than $3 less, but they're not that much. Now, imagine for a second that your vote changes the policy of Exxon, one of the biggest polluters in the world. How much is worth that to you? I'm sorry to say, unless you are kind of Donald Trump, you care a little bit about pollution, it's hard to imagine that you are not willing to pay $3 to change the outcome of Exxon.
Right.
Okay? As a result, if you get diversified shareholders to vote, they're going to vote in a more pro-social way. This is like a big inspiration to introduce shareholder democracy.
Right. How do you implement shareholder democracy?
That's what the third part. Absolutely.
Is it the government or is it?
No. Okay, so that's the third part. Okay, so what is the obstacle is that I know, Ralph, you're very dedicated to the environment, but I'm pretty sure that you didn't pay attention to what the fund you have in 401k voted because you're too busy, right? They make you work so hard on the podcast that you don't have time to do this stuff, right? And you're very rational. And you say, wait a minute, what is my probability that I make a difference? Very, very small. Is it worth an hour of my time to do that? No. So you don't vote. So this is called in jargon rational apathy. Okay, because it's not a stupid choice you're making. It's the rational choice. Might be not good for society. That's the reason why we tell people you should vote. And we have all this campaign about voting in presidential election. But even in presidential election, almost half of the people don't vote every 4 years. Now, here it comes to 500 companies a year. That's a bit taxing, right? So I think the chances of getting this through is not going to work. So this is where we took a page from some new movement that are in political science that are rediscovering what I call in jargon citizen assembly. Citizen assembly are randomly drawn group of people that are representative, thanks to statistics, are paid so that they have the incentive to participate, and they actually represent and formulate some guidelines for the population at large. So one of the big successes of this has been in Ireland, where no politician had the courage to touch an abortion law, and they randomly drew a bunch of citizens, and they came up with a very good compromise that then was ratified in a referendum. And so our idea is most of the power now is concentrated in the hands of three big mutual funds family. And so if this mutual fund family were to organize an investor assembly for their investors, this investor assembly could give the guidelines on how to vote. Instead of having Larry Fink decide or having some technocrats decide on how to vote, have a representative sample of your population investor. And our claim, we'll see whether this is true or not, but our claim is that these guys are going to be forced to do that. Why? Because they have so much power that in democracy they cannot survive. Now, either we go completely to a fascist regime, and then that's a different story, because then they will continue because they're part of the fascist regime. But if we maintain a democracy, democracy detests concentration of power without accountability. Okay? And so we are providing a way that is legal, feasible, economically feasible, and gives them legitimacy and costs them no more than $1 million a year. Okay? So that's peanuts in the grand scheme of things, right? And so I think that actually, to quote Milton Friedman, the role of economists is to prepare ideas that seems impossible until the day they become inevitable. And that's exactly what we're doing.
Well, that sounds great. That's an incredibly interesting idea, and one I will be following with great interest. I can't wait for your book to come out. And it's been just a joy talking to you, Luigi. I really appreciate your being here and sharing your thoughts and ideas with us. Thanks for listening. This podcast is a production of Economics for Inclusive Prosperity, a network of leading economists looking beyond neoliberalism and economic nationalism to answer the question, how do we build a more inclusive, more sustainable, and more prosperous economy for everyone? Our show is produced in collaboration with the Reimagining the Economy project at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. The co-producer of this podcast is Tony Ditta. Please join us again in 2 weeks for another new episode. And if you like our content, please share us on social media and remember to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or your favorite podcasting app.